Dr. Ives' talk for tonight is titled Gramsci, Language, Politics, and Hegemony. His talk will be followed by a response from Professor Zaslov that I will introduce later. For the time being, please join me in welcoming Peter Ives.
Just under 2 years ago now, shortly after the election of Donald Trump, my Facebook feed was filled with references to Antonio Gramsci. Many of these were from people who didn't know Gramsci too well, or like my sister, what she knew of him was through me. And it was this funny quote, this quote or misquote or questionable quote: "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." It is catchy. And I felt a little pedantic, thinking about how there's a problem of translation here. It's sort of ripped from the context. I wasn't sure if Gramsci's actual meaning was lost at all. I was quite curious because the actual phrase in Italian, fenomeni morbosi, is most commonly translated, or the most common translation in English is in the 1971 anthology Selections from the Prison Notebooks, which is the most widely read of Gramsci's translations. And that quote is from page 279. And they translated it morbid phenomena, not monsters. And it does seem like there's a big difference between morbid phenomena and monsters. The translation I like better is that by Joseph Buttigieg, and it's from the English translation of the critical edition that Alessandra mentioned, that we'll be hearing more about sort of that tomorrow, I presume. But the very important 1975 Geratana Italian critical edition, which is the English translation will not be completed before the next Italian translation is out, but the interesting thing about the quote is Joseph Buttigieg translated it morbid phenomena, which is much more literal, and that is from Notebook 3, Note 34, so it was Volume 2, so it was published in 1996. So we have these two English translations that are widely circulating, that are not translated as the internet meme comes across. The old world is dying, the new world struggles to come forth, now is the time of monsters. Instead, we have the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, so that's quite different. In the interregnum, which doesn't even appear in the meme, morbid phenomena of the most varied kind come to pass. So with many other people, I was curious as to the source of this meme, the internet meme, and before long, the blogosphere unearthed the path leading back to that attention-seeking philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And there was speculation that he had read it in the French and translated it from the French to the English. I decided I wouldn't sort of go down that rabbit hole and figure out the veracity of that comment, because I was much more interested in the popularity of the meme relative to these common translations. And to some extent, I understand. Donald Trump had just been elected. I, too, wanted to call Donald Trump a monster. And there was something comforting about the theoretical or political heft of Antonio Gramsci helping me do this. Although I'm not sure anybody needs that much theoretical heft to call the monstrosities of the Trump administration to understand them, but somehow calling them morbid phenomena doesn't quite cut it in the Twitterverse. And if we can yell at our computer screens that Trump is a monster and at the same time have this intimation that the old world of capitalist excess, inequality, and exploitation is indeed dying, and we just have to wait for the struggle of new, better times to be born, there is something that's hopeful and comforting about that. Of course, that's not what Gramsci meant, is the point. Perhaps we could see, perhaps falsely we would see, that other phrase that is also sometimes falsely attributed to Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, a phrase that Gramsci did not coin himself. Gramsci quoted for the first time in 1920, quoted Romain Rolland in his critique of the anarchists. Now, of course, Gramsci did adopt it as a sort of motto, and I actually think it actually does capture a lot of his spirit in terms of the need to have a critical assessment, however gloomy, however pessimistic, however realistic there is of the intellect, but that should not lead us into passivity and Gramsci's abhorrence and continued abhorrence for passivity, and the need for critical assessment is captured nicely in that phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But Gramsci would emphasize that optimism of the will needs the right conditions and particularly specific organization and leadership. But certainly I think we should ask a bit more about what's going on here and what are these patterns. And certainly it is striking the number of concepts that we come to think of Gramscian concepts that are not Gramscian concepts, that are other people's concepts that Gramsci has retooled, has redeveloped. And many of them, and I think Roland Romain would agree with the spirit of much of Gramsci's works, but many of these concepts that we think of as Gramsci, the original authors would be very troubled by what Gramsci does with them in his hands. So the two I want to talk to about tonight, to give this sense of Gramsci's methods, are this phrase, all men are philosophers, or all people are philosophers, and passive revolution. Neither of these were Gramsci's coinage. Even sometimes I see the word hegemony is attributed to Gramsci as well, so one could play the same game with that very concept, but I will leave that aside. Certainly, what I want to focus on is what Anne Shostak-Sassoon has referred to as Gramsci's subversion of the language of politics. And I think many Gramsci scholars have pointed out the importance of Gramsci's method, perhaps over the concept of hegemony or the individual concepts, and certainly would focus on the cluster of concepts and the method, which often is harder to grasp, but is perhaps more important. And so I will give you these two examples. So, all men are philosophers was a phrase, an argument made by the liberal Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce. Croce used that phrase much more like Immanuel Kant used that sense of great philosophical ideas would trickle down and have an influence on how at least educated people understand the world, and that's why philosophy is important. Gramsci, of course, flips that on its head, emphasizing that everyone is capable and to some extent engages in intellectual activity, the organizing of our experiences, making sense of the world, however chaotic that might be. As a thoughtful follower of Marx, Gramsci insisted that intellectual and even philosophical activity is not some elite special quality that only exceptional individuals possess. Quite the contrary, it is that potential of combining intellectual and physical activity and labor which distinguishes humans, as Marx obviously argued. But of course, Gramsci, in a famous passage often quoted, which was from Notebook 12, Section 1, about the intellectuals and the history of intellectuals, Gramsci argued, not everyone functions as an intellectual. And we often look for others to organize how we intellectually guide ourselves through the world. Gramsci notes especially that subaltern groups that are oppressed and exploited, have a much greater dissonance between experiences of daily life and the ideologies which are created by, as Gramsci famously described, traditional intellectuals. And this, of course, gives rise to a concept we'll be hearing more about this weekend, that notion of the organic intellectuals, to some extent, who always remain much more close to their original social origins of their social groups. Of course, Gramsci did talk about the organic intellectuals of the ruling class, who are the traditional intellectuals. So it's not a simple dichotomy. And it's not that the organic intellectuals are always on the side of the subalterns, but it was an analytic distinction. Now, obviously, this is related to Gramsci's long, important discussion of common sense and the role of intellectuals in that. I won't go into any more detail on that, except for I will point out Kate Crehan's excellent, fairly recent book that talks about subalternity, intellectuals, and common sense, and then gives 3 case studies, one of which is the Tea Party movement. She wrote it before Trump, it won the Sermani. It co-won the Sermani Book Prize with the other book that I'll talk about in a second. But it's a very nice exploration of some of these themes. So that's one example. The other example I want to turn to is that of passive revolution. Now, Gramsci is often awarded the author of this term, and yet it was used by Vincenzo Cuoco, who is a conservative Italian historian, who was celebrating the bloodless, the less violent, the less chaotic revolution in Naples in 1799. And Gramsci, of course, turns that concept on its head. He rejects this celebration of passivity. He argues that in order for revolutionary change to be truly profound and transformational, it needs to get to the fundamental aspects of the historical juncture and the contradictions within it, and this will necessarily involve the people, the masses. It will be cataclysmic. And in that sense, passive revolution, which Cuoco used as a positive term, becomes a way for Gramsci to theorize what we would now call band-aid solutions, reformism, and those types of questions. Now, Gramsci connects these to a series of other themes that he's interested in: Restoration, Revolution. He applies it to different historical periods, not only the Italian Risorgimento, but the Reformation, and so forth. So we have these 2 examples about Gramsci's use of particular phrases or particular concepts. And as I said, Anne Shostak-Sassoon has sort of theorized around that method. I just want to add to that a key point that Edoardo Sanguinetti made about the prison writings, which he describes as that there is almost catastrophic evidence, end quote, of the tentative cautionary nature of Gramsci's writings in prison. Sanguinetti notes that Gramsci's language is filled with hesitations, littered with limiting phrases, such as "in some senses," "in a certain aspect," "it may be said," putting lots of things in quotation marks. Quite often people criticize those postmodernists for putting things in quotation marks. Well, Gramsci was doing that a long time before postmodernism arose. Sanguinetti concludes that this is because for Gramsci, quote, "words are not things. They go through a perpetual transformation in which communication is always, in some way, precarious, namely exposed to misunderstanding and full of consequences, because to say is truly to do." And I won't go off on a tangent there, although part of me really wants to, comparing this position to J.L. Austin's very famous How to Do Things with Words. But sticking back to Gramsci, this is not an accident that Gramsci is nervous about but pays special attention to language. After all, he studied linguistics at university. It was called philology at the time, but when he was at the University of Turin, that was one of his major foci. Some Gramsci scholars sort of present this as an early interest that was then jettisoned when he became a Marxist, when he became more interested in journalism and politics. But there's tons of evidence to show that throughout his life he was transfixed and clearly saw connections between Italian language politics and language politics in general and his political and cultural analysis. Indeed, one of the first books he requested from prison was the Breviario di Linguistica by his former linguistics professor Matteo Bartoli and Giulio Bertoni. And that was published in 1925, so just a couple years earlier. So he's not reminiscing about his old university days. He's keeping up on the latest that they're working on. And certainly, since many Gramsci scholars have teased out this, and certainly a lot of my earlier work was trying to make some of these ideas accessible to English reading audiences. The other book I have up here, Alessandro Carlucci's quite recent, excellent book, which also co-won the Sermani Book Prize with Kate Crehan's book. Gramscian Languages, Unification, Diversity, and Hegemony contributes considerably to this sort of type of emphasis and reading of Gramsci. And Carlucci, myself, and many others have noted that a lot of Gramsci's discussions of the dissonance and fragmentations within subaltern social groups have this linguistic element. And certainly Gramsci was very critical of the fact that he argued that Italy did not have a truly common national language. Italy was politically unified in 1861. There was a literary language, a written language, and then there was a host of vernacular languages. And it was there was a political project of we need a standard Italian. One did not exist in any real sense. The famous novelist of The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, was appointed to the head of a commission to create and propagate the standard Italian. And unlike the other side of the debate, who wanted it to be based upon the written literary language, Manzoni was very influenced by German Romanticism and was very focused on spoken languages as living languages. So his solution to the lack of an Italian language was to take the bourgeois Florentine language as the model. So the idea was, as you create grammar books and textbooks based on this spoken language, and quite interestingly, you recruit all the school teachers from Italy, from around Florence, from the Tuscan region, and they disseminate this national standard on the rest of Italy. Following the Italian linguist Isaiah Graziadei Ascoli, Gramsci criticized this project, at first in linguistic terms, basically by arguing that this is basically foisting a foreign language upon much of southern Italy, and that to southern Italians and peasant Italians, that this is not their language, it's a new language, it might as well be Esperanto. He makes that comparison in his critique of Esperanto as well. And more than that, and to some extent, I should say, he uses Ascoli's model, that the reason this is the case is because the previous languages, the vernaculars, or if you want to call them dialects, or the linguistic term is the linguistic substratum, would exert pressure on the imposed language. And so you would have hybridity, you wouldn't have a truly common language, the differences would remain. Now Gramsci extended this, even fairly early on, to much more political questions and questions about other social and cultural and economic discrepancies between the north and south of Italy. And to some extent, you can see, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were very much focused on, and even that one reading of Hegemony in terms of the alliance between the urban proletariat, that in Russia was very small and Italy was smaller than the peasantry, but that relationship was crucial. And so this becomes a major theme within Gramsci's work, and it lasts right up into the 29th, his last notebook that he started in prison, which is, by the earlier numbers, numbered the 29th notebook. So much of this earlier work on Gramsci and linguistics was conducted by Franco Lopipro, and he wrote a very important book in 1979, Lingua Intellettuale, Hegemonia and Gramsci. He highlighted the consistent themes of language and linguistics, and also showed that even the very term hegemonia was used by linguists at the time, often as a synonym of other linguistic terms to talk about linguistic attraction, how languages spread, what forms of language spread where, in a sort of geographical linguistic school of thought, and that by the time Gramsci would have learnt about Lenin and the Russian Social Democrats and other Marxists' use of the term of hegemony, he had already been familiar with it through linguistics. So this sort of is an important argument. However, implicit in the 1979 book, and made much more explicit in Lopipro's later writing, is this false sense, I argue, that Marxism and linguistics are two incompatible sources. So I've argued at length elsewhere that Lo Pipero falsely constructs this sense of wanting a single source of Gramsci's originality and finding it outside Marxism. To add to that more textual side of that argument, the recent work by Craig Brandist, The Dimensions of Hegemony, Language, Culture, and the Politics of Revolutionary Russia, goes through linguistics from the 1900s through post-revolutionary Russia, and argues that actually, even in that supposedly Marxist discussion, language was centrally important and linguists were always involved. Certainly, when Lenin was asking the question of what do we do in post-revolutionary Russia with the non-Russian nations, he was involved with linguists and these linguistic questions. Before the rise of Stalin and Nikolai Mar's prestige, Lenin was always advocating multilingualism and linguistic diversity. In that sense, we have a much richer, even more so than 15 years ago, I think we have a much richer picture. We also know much more about Gramsci's time in Russia, and previously it was sort of thought that he spent most of his time in Russia convalescing, and actually we know now that he spent much more time actively involved and would have been much more knowledgeable of these types of political as well as linguistic debates. What does this linguistics consist of? So I'm sort of saying language is important, Gramsci's linguistics is important. Matteo Bartoli, his professor at the University of Turin, he coined the term neolinguistics and then later aerial linguistics, but one of his major objects of critique were the neo-grammarians, the philologists in Leipzig, who were historical linguistics arguing about sound change, but they were different from their predecessors in that they argued that sound change could be described by internal exceptionless laws. And we don't need to go into the details too much, except for the most important thing here is that Ferdinand De Saussure, who many of you will recognize, was a linguist, and everybody knows it's Saussure's lectures at the end of his life that gave birth to structuralism. Well, before that, he wasn't one of the neo-grammarians, but he was writing in their journals. He was within that ambit, and he was a historical linguist. And certainly, it seems to me that whole emphasis on language as a structure synchronically that we get from Saussure that gave birth to structuralism, and then through Claude Lévi-Strauss and anthropology came to be structuralism within the social sciences at large through linguistic structuralism, that to some extent that picture was not, it was very far from the neo-grammarians because they were just focused on language change historically, but they perceived of language as an internal structure and its cultural, social, and political aspects they were uninterested in, and they said couldn't explain language change. And it was Bartoli who was arguing that no, language change has to be described within its cultural and political context, and language isn't this rarefied system. So it's there that I think is crucially important that we see Gramsci taking that and applying it much broader than Bartoli was. And to some extent it also, I think, helps us think through perhaps many of the debates that came in the 1980s and 90s around post-structuralism, which is obviously critiquing the Saussurean model, and Marxism, right? And so we have that debate in the 90s. Gramsci is often referred to in the English language versions of that debate, or those debates, I should say. But the fact that he was a linguist sort of escapes people like Leclain-Mouffe, who are making detailed arguments precisely about those movements. And more than that, we also then had Noam Chomsky, and I won't spend too much time talking about Noam Chomsky, but he too, in a very different way, but still has a sense that language is a formal structure and it can be divorced, and the science of linguistics needs to be divorced from the messiness of politics and social stratification and culture. So it's all of these visions of language as this object that Gramsci's professor, and then in the prison notebooks it's very clear Gramsci is also critiquing. So in notebook 11, section 12, he puts language in quotes, linguaggio in quotes. He says, in language there is contained a specific conception of the world, but and then he goes on to describe how that conception is disjointed and episodic, and sometimes there's attempts to mechanically impose ideologies to straighten it out. As Stefano Gensini summarizes, for Gramsci, you can read it as well, language appears as the real terrain where civil and political society intersect, as the site of socialization and separation of experiences, knowledge, and needs. Likewise, language appears as the decisive dimension of politico-cultural stratification of the class system that crosses and defines the ways of thinking and feeling of entire populations, from common sense to scientific theories of reality. So in here, this very much reminds me of Valentin Voloshinov's discussion of language as a terrain of struggle. And sometimes today I've been reading about how the right is weaponizing speech, and speech is getting weaponized here and there as if these are new things. Oddly enough, I don't think these are new things. I think language has always been a terrain of struggle. Now, we need to be a bit cautious here because, and numerous people do this, they pick one side of the critique of positivism within linguistics that Gramsci and Voloshinov have, and sometimes they forget the other side of the critique. And the other major school, and Voloshinov is very helpful here because he sort of paints them in very clear lines of the two schools that oppose each other. And Voloshinov is the one who takes Benedetto Croce as the main representative of the other side, what he calls the individual subjectivist side. And I won't go into Gramsci's relationship to Croce, but it's crucially important, so he's an important figure. But for tonight, I'm going to focus just on a linguist, Karl Vossler, who was, very much in this idealistic Crocean vision of language as expressive activity, as not a structure, as being the opposite of structure, as just being expressive. Croce famously tried to argue that translation doesn't exist because every new utterance is a new expression. Vossler uses this interesting metaphor. It changes now that we have global warming and climate change issues, but Vossler argued that we can think about weather and climate, and weather is something that really exists, and then climate is just this abstraction from that. Climate doesn't exist. It's just the repetition of weather over and over again, right? And this was the other side of the dominant school of linguistics at the time that Voloshinov was critical of, and Gramsci is very critical of it as well. And certainly we can see that, even if we don't think about humans having an impact on climate, that metaphor doesn't really work because, we create language and we use language. And I want to show you at the end of this talk, one of the ways in which Gramsci theorizes through that. Certainly, one of the other things I do, as Alessandra mentioned in the introduction, is look at contemporary debates around global English, and you find some scholars like Alistair Pennycook and Suresh Kanagaraja who actually quote Voloshinov in the critique of structuralism and then forget that he also critiques Croce, and then these are the people who are saying language doesn't exist, languages don't exist, there's just languaging, there's just translanguaging, we just have linguistic resources, and that this idea of a stable language is just the imposition of European Enlightenment and the nation state. And it's sort of an interesting argument. I think there's some validity to thinking it through, but I think there's huge problems in not understanding that structures of language do exist. And actually, I think what Gramsci tells us is that power exists within structures of language. So Gramsci's insistent that when we make meaning, it doesn't always adhere to individual utterances. A lot of times our meaning precisely depends upon what Roland Barthes would call the second order signification, that notion of the languages that we are using or the way we use language. Now, and here I think I have time. I'm doing okay for time. So I will go on a bit of a tangent to talk about global English, which obviously is a phenomena that didn't exist when Gramsci was alive. Certainly David Crystal, who's that Cambridge expert on English, estimates, it's difficult to estimate these things, but he estimates that in 1950 there was about 250 million speakers of English in the world, and that by 2000 there were 2 billion. So this is a fourfold increase in the speakers of a given language. It's never happened in human history before. Most importantly there, though, is the fact that most of these new speakers of language, it isn't their mother tongue or their native language. And lots of sociolinguistic work now both focuses on that, but then also questions this concept of the mother tongue and the native language. And this is something that I actually think one can see is not too far from some of the ideas that Gramsci was getting towards. It's fascinating. There's a great book by Thomas Bonfiglio, who looks at the metaphor of the mother tongue and basically says before Dante it barely existed, and he does a sort of corpus analysis of ancient Greek and Rome texts and says that there's almost no alliance between maternity and language, and that there's a few alliances between places where paternity in language, where the father's language is seen as crucially important. But it's not until the 14th, 15th century that the idea of the mother tongue takes off. And there's a great book by Paolo Gambarotta, Irresistible Signs, from 2011, where she makes the argument that the mother tongue as a concept is crucial to conflate spoken vernacular languages with written standard languages. And that's how sort of this mother tongue, and Dante's phrase is interesting because, Dante says we learn the mother tongue from the nursemaid. So it's not even the mother that we learn the mother tongue from, it's the nursemaid. And then all of a sudden everybody's talking about a mother tongue as if it's natural, right? And it's sort of fascinating, and some of it is because of the dominance of Chomsky linguistics in the 20th century. It takes a long time and lots of empirical evidence to show, there's lots of multilingual places in the world. How can we always come back to this idea of a native language, or L1 as they often call it, versus L2, as if this is a huge divide? It's very hard educationally to make an argument that something's going on there and that's a huge division. Nevertheless, all of this comes up precisely because we have global English, which is spoken mostly by people who it is not their first language. They don't see it as their first language, and you have a whole bunch of questions of the ownership of language and what happens if a majority of people speak a language that they don't think that they own. And these are all debates that are happening in scholars like Braj Katru, who founded the journal World Englishes, but none of it sort of connected back to either debates around globalization or certainly not theories of language. So part of my broader project is to actually look to how most of the debates around global English take one of two forms. They either go the sort of neoliberal cosmopolitan route and say, language is really just an instrument of communication. It's just as John Locke said in the 17th century, to get ideas from one head to another. It's just an instrument, it's a vehicle. And the other side of the debate has its legacy through Johann Gottfried Herder and German Romanticism, but up through Charles Taylor today, and others who express that sort of that identity, the subjectivity, and all those things within language. And to some extent, I think a lot of the debates around global English can be boiled down into adding different versions of either of those models. And to some extent, I would argue that Gramsci provides a quite different alternative to either of those approaches. But that's a much bigger project. Coming back to, really, tonight I'm just talking about the meme. That's all I'm doing tonight. It's just the meme. But certainly the other crucial concept that I've used in different ways and described to do, and used to do different things, I should say. But that is this concept that Gramsci uses of normative grammar. Now, normative grammar is a concept that he raises in the last substantive notebook that he begins in prison, and he's actually not in prison anymore. He's in the medical clinic because his health is very much failing him. There's arguments that he actually had there's much less censorship during this period on him, and what does he choose to write? But he begins this notebook with the title Notes for an Introduction to the Study of Grammar. And in there, he raises this concept of normative grammar. Now, normative grammar has been around at least since 1660 in the Port Royal grammar, and the time in which grammar was synonymous with Latin. It was the notion of normative grammar is the idea that you have a structure of rules that tell us how to correctly speak a language. It's connected to a written form. It's a pedagogical purpose. It's totally connected to this idea of standardizing languages and lining up the spoken and the written languages, a topic which Gramsci writes about earlier in the prison notebooks. But in this 29th notebook, he brings up this concept of normative grammar and defines it as made up of reciprocal monitoring, reciprocal teaching, and reciprocal censorship. He puts in scare quotes. Expressed in such questions as, what did you mean to say? What do you mean? Make yourself clearer, etc. And in mimicry and teasing. This whole complex of actions and reactions come together to create a grammatical conformism, to establish norms or judgments of correctness and incorrectness. But this spontaneous expression, again, spontaneous in quotation marks, of grammatical conformity is necessarily disconnected, discontinuous, and limited to the social strata or local centers. So in a certain sense, once again, not unlike, well, in different ways, but there's a similar pattern here with passive revolution, with everyone as a philosopher. He's taken a concept from everyday usage, from somewhere, and totally redefined it, right? And Gramsci, elsewhere in the prison notebooks, is critical of people inventing new words for things and sort of that sense of jargony. And if you have a new phenomena, you invent a new word. If you're trying to describe something new, Gramsci tends to reinterpret concepts that we already have. Certainly, and I'll come back to the notion of spontaneity in a second, but he's clearly extending the idea of normative grammar to include oral speech. It's very clear in that definition that his description is that of oral speech. And he extends it clearly to this notion of imposing a form of language, learning the rules, but in a informal scenario, mimicry and teasing, even that sort of even on the street type of communication. And crucially here, it's not only the mimicry and teasing, but also it's about understanding. So the questions are, very importantly, what do you mean, right? That's a pretty innocent question. Obviously, we can all know those situations in our lives when, if we're at a job interview, we're less likely to say to the person who might or might not give us a job, what do you mean? I don't understand you, right? If you say that too many times, that's a problem, right? Whereas if you're interviewing somebody for a job, yeah, you can demand that they re-explain themselves over and over again, right? So, it's that power dynamic which is precisely at the heart of communication, right? So these are communicative aspects. Now, just in case we were thinking that Gramsci's too abstract here. He gives us a nice, although pertinent, example, or two examples. A peasant who moves to the city ends up conforming to the urban speech through the pressure of the city environment. So once again, the imposition of this normative grammar isn't just about how to speak correctly, it is the imposition of social stratification, things that William Labov and sociolinguists study intensely in the 1960s and 70s, and still today to some extent. It also obviously relates to Gramsci's notion of common sense. And hopefully we can see some senses of prestige and hegemony within that question of who are the intellectuals, who's doing the organizing, and those types of questions. But now, prior to defining normative grammar, Gramsci introduces the other type of grammar. He says, how many types of grammar are there? Well, there's lots of different types of grammar, but there are two standard ones, and I don't think Gramsci is particularly unique in this. I think it's a fairly common way of constructing things for linguists at the time, when he says that there's also a grammar immanent in language that we use even without knowing it. And he uses the terms immanent and spontaneous more or less synonymously in the 29th notebook. In a certain sense, they're both important concepts, because elsewhere in the notebooks he talks about immanence and the concept of immanence in relationship to Kant, which I won't go into, but I'll focus on the concept of spontaneity and spontaneous, which he also talks about in terms of philosophy and generally, not specifically language, earlier in the notebooks. And to some extent, with the linguistic example, we can see that you think, somebody who is spontaneous, it is this liberal notion of unencumbered freedom, right? They are using language, they are following the patterns of language, but it was never imposed upon them. They just, that was just how it came out, right? I was just following the rules. It's immaterial if I'm being coerced to follow the rules, because I don't even know I'm following the rules, right? I can't be coerced to following the rules. I'm just speaking, and the patterns are there, right? So there's no mimicry and teasing, there's no power relationship. It seems, at first anyway, that he's constructing this notion of normative grammar as that hegemonic imposition, as opposed to this free, unencumbered self who gets to express themselves freely and without coercion. And then the coercion-consent dichotomy is not so crucial. But very early in the prison notebooks, in notebook 3, which is the same notebook of the morbid phenomena passage, the interregnum passage that I'll come back at the end to again. But just a dozen notes after that, he addresses the concept of spontaneity. And he says that pure spontaneity does not exist in history. In the most spontaneous movement, it is simply the case that the elements of conscious leadership cannot be checked, have left no reliable document. It may be said that spontaneity is therefore characteristic of the history of the subaltern classes, and indeed their most marginal and peripheral elements. So we do not have this liberal notion of free expression with spontaneous grammar. The spontaneous grammar arises because we forget about the process of imposition, and we're unaware of might want to use the term ideology which we are following, and that it is organized for us, and it seems natural, right? It seems natural, it's naturalized. We can speak without knowing it, right? Follow the rules of grammar without knowing it. And I would argue that is, in a certain sense, a lot of the different themes, and obviously one of the great things about hegemony is that it deals with things at the cultural level, at the micro level, but it also deals with broad political questions of civil society and the state, and class relationships and those things. But in a certain sense, those dynamics of coercion and consent, and a lot of times people do read hegemony as if it is still sort of some combination of coercion and consent, as if they're opposites. And it seems to me that just like with normative grammar and spontaneous grammar, coercion and consent need to be understood dialectically, right? You can't just say what is coercion. Coercion is that which is not consented to, or what is consent? It's when I do something that is not coerced. So And certainly it's fascinating that Gramsci does this at the level of his analysis of the phenomena in Italy and what Italy is like to allow for the rise of fascism. He's very critical of the Fashion Education Act of 1923 because of the role that language teaching doesn't actually play in that and doesn't work towards creating a national language for Italy. So, and this is why I find him so compelling to think about global English, because on one hand, he's saying Italy needs a national language, a truly popular, common language. But at the other hand, he's critical of how it is being carried out by the governments of his day, or then by the fascists not being carried out because they like the fragmentation, because it enables them to keep the class alliances between the northern industrialists and the southern landowners and prevent any type of solidification of alliances between the southern peasantry and the northern proletariat. So in that sense, I think we can see Gramsci's politics of language as crucially important. But also, I'm hoping that we can come back to the longer passage from which, I don't know whether it was Zizek or not. I suppose I should do my homework and go check. I don't really care, though. But the longer passage from which the quote is driven, and it's, I'll let you read it for yourself, but there is that sense he's talking about a crisis of authority. He's talking about a serious rupture. I think these are all things that, I do think, one can overgeneralize and say it's just like the rise of fascism at the early part of the 20th century. I think that's mistaken. But at the same time, I think we need to see some of the patterns, and I think that we can look at this passage and find it still useful. But the huge point is that from the passage, Gramsci is not offering a palliative. He's certainly not saying, you're gonna witness bizarre, monstrous things, but just sit back and relax, because we know this is just a sign of the falling away of the old order and the new order that, in Gramsci's writings, he's saying it cannot be born. He doesn't say that it will be born someday. I guess the birth metaphor, you might say that's inevitable. I don't know. It does seem that isn't Gramsci's point. Clearly, in this note, he does immediately after this passage say that we need to connect this point to an earlier note he wrote in Notebook 1, Note 27, The Question of the Young. And there, he's discussing generational conflict between the old and new. He argues that in what we might call normal times, the young are always rebellious, but the old are in charge of education. And so, to some extent, this rebelliousness always gets educated out, or at least it's the hegemonic group is capable of creating an elite cadre that can hold the historical bloc together, whereas in times of rupture, this educational dynamic is absent, and he talks about the morbid, so he uses the same word, forms of mysticism, sensualism, moral indifference, and pathological deprivation that occur when old ideas are no longer hold, and there is this crisis of authority. So again, he is describing, presumably with the pessimist of the intellect, the death of the old ideologies, and he does, in this passage, say that there is an unprecedented potential for the expansion of historical materialism. So, in that sense, there is an opening. I'm not sure we can call it an optimism, but it's certainly an opening for historical materialism. So I'll end with the point that we may be in a time of monsters or morbid phenomena or symptoms, but we need to understand the the rupture and crisis of authority that both created things like Trump and Brexit and Modi and the Brazilian elections, and create an adequate response, which is obviously something I haven't even, is the bigger question, which I'm not going to touch right now, but hopefully other presentations will and other people will, in order to usher in that new society. Thank you.